Good evening, my friends. Are you here for another story? Then come on in. Have a drink, a bite to eat, and settle in by the fire. For tonight, I have quite the tale to tell. Are you ready? Good. Then let us begin. Our last story covered my investigating a potential witch's grave from back in the 1800s. Tonight, we'll venture forth in time a little ways to the early 1900s with a story passed down in my grandparents' community. Fair warning, this does follow the common ghost story formula of many of the darker Appalachian ghost stories, and you'll soon see why. Even though I feel it is light enough for YouTube, those sensitive among you should seek out your tissues now or go rewatch one of my funnier stories. Do you remain intrigued? Then listen well to the story of the Wailing Cavern. This tale was another one relayed to me by my granny and papa. While neither of them were around to witness it, as this occurred nearly 30 to 40 years before either of them came along, it is still remembered very well by many of the older folks in their community. For, if there is one truth I know in this world, it is that mountain folk have long memories for dark stories, and this one is no exception. The area in which my grandparents live is in the middle of a long expanse of rolling hills, with most farms cut from the deep woodland that seems to permeate all but the rockiest of cliffsides. Dotted throughout the landscape are many sinkholes and caverns, most of the latter hidden until winter, and most of the former unseen until you are directly upon them. Centuries ago, these caves were frequented by the Cherokee, usually using them to store food, to hunt wildlife that bedded in those caves, or even as places of permanent repose. When most of the Cherokee were forced out and settlers moved in, the newcomers, too, began using the caves as ready food cellars and spring wells, in some cases. We begin our story well back in those hills, down into the dusty dirt footpaths and hollows that crisscross beneath tall canopies of walnut, hickory, and oak. According to my grandparents, this was told to Papa's parents from a neighbor who lived farther out in the woodland. Back then, it wasn't unusual to hear things that sounded like screams coming from the woods at night. Usually, it turned out to be a fox or a bobcat, and those critters never stick around for long after finding either food or mates. However, the sound of a child crying, now that was unusual. The first reports came about one night as one man was headed home after helping on his friend's farm. As he ambled down the dark and dusty road, he slowly began to realize that the cricket chirping that he was so used to hearing had been interspersed with a distant sound of a child crying. The farther he walked, the louder it became, only to die away again as he traveled onward. He knew there were several families besides his own that lived in those parts, and the natural terrain of the hills gave way to the least little sound being echoed. He figured it was merely someone from one of those farmsteads, so he continued onwards, quickly forgetting the incident. A few nights went by, and he found himself returning from the same farm along the same dark country road. This time, when he approached the same area, he heard it again, the unmistakable sound of a baby crying. Only this time, the noise unnerved him. The child sounded weak, sickly, yet the wailing was constant. It reminded him of when one of his younger siblings had caught the croup as a child, how she would bawl, and how weak she was by the time the disease had passed through her. Once he got to a certain point in the road, however, the crying once again stopped. Even though he didn't have a lot of money, he decided he would check around at church and see if there was anything he could do. In the very least, he could offer his prayers in hopes the little one would get better. The strange thing, however, is that when he did ask around at church that evening, nobody in the vicinity had any sick children that would have been around that age. To make matters even more bizarre, several other local homesteaders had also witnessed the crying baby noise and had asked around. But it wasn't until that point that any of them were finally able to fill in the gaps. They all quickly came to the theory that there were some vagrants living up in the woods between their properties. Even though most of them would have been willing to help a sickly child if they could, they weren't keen on dealing with beggars or thieves that might snatch away some of their hard-earned crops or chickens. A few of them went to the sheriff to see what could be done. Since no one seemed to hear the child's crying during the day, the sheriff figured that maybe the baby's parents would wander around during the day and come back to the area at night. He found it strange as no one had talked of spotting any vagrants in the area, but he assured them that he would check it out. Together with a couple of deputies, the sheriff followed a few local men out to where they heard the noise. They were unable to find anything during the day, but once night rolled around, sure enough, the telltale wail could be heard again. Armed with full lanterns, the group plunged into the woods, walking up through the tree-smothered hills to find the source of the crying. Eventually, they came across a cave that had been partially obscured by heavy underbrush. When they shoved aside the knotted mess of briars and mossy, viney tendrils, the crying ceased. The sheriff held up his lantern and called into the cave. No answer. He called again, beckoning to the parents to come out, that they could tell the baby was sick from the cries, and that, while they weren't going to be in trouble, they really needed to move along and stop trespassing. Still no answer. The sheriff then nodded towards the cavern's mouth, and the group headed inside. Upon entering, they were surprised to find that the cave was empty. In fact, there were no signs that anyone had ever stayed in the cave. No campfire sites, no blankets, no bundles of hay or pine needles for bedding, not even an old iron skillet to cook something in. To say the men were perplexed was putting it mildly. As they wandered around the cave, the sheriff noticed a very large mound of rocks in the back. Wondering if someone might be hiding behind there with a child, he held his light high and approached. There, he found the child. Or rather, the child's corpse. It was clear that the infant who had been placed there had been dead for a very, very long time. Perhaps months had gone by since it had been placed there. The body was so far gone that he could no longer tell the gender or what the cause of death might have been, but it was obvious the child was just an infant. Of course, when word got out, the whole community was troubled. No one knew who could have just abandoned a baby in that cave, or why. Were they too poor to feed it? Was it from an unwed mother, or the product of an affair that someone wanted to keep hidden? Or was it really the child of vagrants, one that had been birthed in the cave, but had not survived to take its first breath in the world? Rumors floated around for weeks, until finally, one young man stepped forward and told the sheriff something strange he had witnessed nearly half a year before. He had been sneaking off to go play with his friends when he spotted a young couple coming up the road. He didn't know them, but noticed they were about his age, mid to late teens, and were dressed a bit shabbier than he was. They didn't notice him because he was in the woods off from the trail, and he didn't speak to them in case they happened to get word back to his parents. He did notice that they looked strangely somber, and the girl was carrying a bundle in her arms. As the boy was returning home later that evening, he just so happened to see the same young couple headed back down the road from where they came. only this time, the girl's arms were bare. He told the sheriff he hadn't thought much about it, because he just figured it was somebody's relatives, and thought they might have left the baby with someone who lived around there, and just came back to get it at some point. There was no way he could have known they were just going to leave the baby in the cave all alone like that. Unfortunately, no further information ever came forth. The remains were given a Christian burial in the cemetery outside of one of the local churches, and people went on with their lives. Still, questions remain. Who was that couple? Why did they just leave their baby behind like that? How did they know about the cave if they were truly strangers? Did some of the neighbors know the true identity of the couple, tell them of the cave, but never let on? What I can tell you is that there was no way anyone should have heard any crying coming from that cave. And while the crying seems to cease after that, they say that on some cold, dark nights, when you approach the path down from that cave, you can hear the faintest wailing of an unseen child. Well, my friends, what do you suppose was the reason this tragedy took place? Please leave your answer in the comments below. If you like this video, please head on over to my Patreon page at patreon.com/phantasmalpoppy. For just $1 a month, you gain early access to all of my content here on YouTube, as well as bonuses for certain goals that I hit. It also helps me out, and that helps me bring you more consistent quality content. Please like this video and share it with all of your friends. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. That way you can catch the next video the moment it comes out. Good night, and see you all real soon.